So, what are we left with then in an attempt to try and assess where secularization is, or what the relationship is between religion and British society in the 20th century? I think the problem really comes down to what we accept to be religious or not. If we have a broad understanding of religious belief, then, like Callum Brown, we'll probably argue that Britain has remained largely Christian up until the 1960s, and that Christianity and Christian values have still driven much of our political and secular culture. If, however, we adopt a more narrow interpretation, then it's fairly obvious that there has been a substantial decline of religious affiliation and an adherence to specifically religious values from probably the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Now, what's really happened that I think is quite interesting and exciting in all of this is that over the last 5 to 10 years, which is really recent history for historians, there has been the emergence, what I think is really a fundamental reassessment of the relationship between religion and society in Britain in the 20th century. Now, much of this has to do with the fact that we're moving on and we're now in the 21st century, and so what seemed very recent is suddenly now getting farther and farther away. But it also has to do with contemporary political events, like the bombings in New York and in London, 9/11 and 7/7, which brought to the fore the issue of religion and politics in a way that I think people hadn't really considered before. Because what it brought home was the question, does religion necessarily have to decline when a society becomes more modern? Historians had always recognized that the United States was a problematic example, but they had always argued that the continuing relevance of religion in American society was a particular result of the United States' particular historical background. They argued that the Americans were the exceptions to the secularization case. However, as they began to look around, they could see that there were many other parts of the world where, despite adopting many of the outward examples or manifestations of modernization, religion still continued to be a vibrant force. So how was this to be explained? So what's happening now is that scholars are now challenging secularization theory outright, and they're even going farther by challenging the entire construct of decline and the entire interpretation of religion in 20th century Britain as one of decline. Instead, they argue that we need to be looking at religion in modern society in new ways. For example, Sarah Williams, who's written about Southwark and popular belief in the late 19th, early 20th century, she argues that the working classes and people on the ground have a much more complex way of envisaging their belief structures, and that decline doesn't really explain these adequately. Instead, we need to try and look at the way people themselves have conceived of religion and how they perceive what it means to be religious and adopt those interpretations as evidence for whether or not a community is in fact religious or not. Jeremy Morris, another historian, he argues that while there has been a definite shrinkage in the infrastructure of religion, in other words, people don't go to church anymore, that in fact, rather than this being a collapse of religious faith, that he still sees evidence of what he terms persistence and transformation. That in fact, rather than the death of Christian Britain, there is the displacement of it. But this is, again, all we're talking about really is not decline, but marginalization. Another historian, Geoffrey Cox, picks up on arguments which have been expressed by the sociologist of religion, Grace Davey. Grace Davey talks about, rather than religious decline, we should be talking about believing without belonging, her phrase. She argues that religious beliefs remain strong and high even within Europe, although institutional affiliation has collapsed. Geoffrey Cox picks up on this and argues that rather than looking at America as the exceptional case for the 20th century, we should really be looking at European exceptionalism. And again, so all of these historians are really trying to get around the concept of decline and argue that decline really isn't relevant anymore. It was only relevant because that's what it looked to us from the 1960s and the 1970s. But from the perspective of 2011, religion has clearly survived in new and interesting and in different ways than we have seen before. So we need to come up with new explanations for that. If we have new ways, therefore, of viewing religion, its significance to British society, and the answer to this question in the 20th century could be fundamentally reconceived. So, for example, adopting Jeremy Morris's arguments, we could argue that, yes, there has been institutional shrinkage by the mainstream churches, but there has been a proliferation in new religious movements, which are far more informal and less hierarchical. We could look at the persistence of personal belief on a range of different moral codes. We could suggest as well a reconfiguration, therefore, of our perceptions of what it actually means to be Christian Britain.